Yeah, well, I think the holistic message touches all of our life. Generosity can be the way we work, our relationships, how we're involved in our communities. But I also think the foundation of that is generosity is not first about external impact. It's about who we're becoming. It's actually generosity from the inside out. And what I think the basis of the holistic mission of generosity, it really is receiving God's generosity.
Welcome to the Generosity Now podcast, where we bring you inspiring stories of generosity and whole life stewardship. Our goal is to showcase individuals and organizations making a positive impact in our communities and across the world. I'm your host, Eric Most, president of the National Christian Foundation, Rocky Mountain Region. I'm joined by my fantastic co-host, Laurie Bossert, VP on our team. Laurie, how are you doing?
Great. It is springtime in the Rockies.
That's right. Well, on today's episode, we have Jeff Haanen, founder of the Denver Institute for Faith and Work, author of Uncommon Guide to Retirement and Working from the Inside Out, joining us. He's a good friend of ours, and we're so thankful that you are here. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Eric and Laurie.
Jeff, would you give our listeners an overview of who you are, how you were raised, where you were raised, and how you came to know Jesus as your Savior?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So live here in Colorado. We're married to my beautiful bride, Kelly. Got 4 daughters. 8, 10, 13, and 15. So I'm in full-time women's ministry now that they're older, for sure, especially after 10 o'clock at night. I was raised principally by my mom in Minnesota, actually. My mom and my sister grew up together and went to college in Indiana. And actually, my faith story is a combination of how I was raised, but I also had a very, I would say, punctiliar experience of faith at the end of high school for me. So I grew up in the church, but I would say I was a pretty skeptical kid. And I had a conversion experience whereby I had an injury. I couldn't play basketball anymore. And that was pretty tough for being a big, 6'5" guy. Not being able to play my senior year of high school was really tough. But that summer before my senior year of high school, I read the New Testament for the first time and read several books of apologetics. Again, I was skeptical, so I wanted to know if this thing was true, and I came to the conclusion it actually was true, and I felt something start to shift inside my heart too, and my life changed after that. So really had this coming to faith experience, 18, 19, kind of a heady experience. I would say I was reading a lot more books about Christian faith even before I was interacting with people. So the lived experience of faith has been something I've always been trying to catch up on. Being early sort of convinced of the truth of the faith. So that's a little bit of an overview of coming to Christ and then my family.
It's neat to hear some of that because you are very much a studied man. That is who you are, and your deep, deep, deep convictions just are really obvious in the way that you walk.
Hey, Jeff, would you give us a scope of your work that you've done over the years? I kind of gave some highlights there in the bio, but tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, scope of my work. Most of my work has been, I would say, educational entrepreneurship. So I've worked in a Christian school, I've worked in higher ed, and for the last 10 years, I built and grew an organization called Denver Institute for Faith and Work, which is focused on gospel work and community renewal. And that kind of work was everything from fundraising, leadership, boards, trying to figure out programs, trying to figure out how I can be a good boss to my team, which my team was very gracious in helping me grow in that. But it's mostly been building and growing organizations. And then I've done a little bit of writing as well. I've written a couple of books, Write for Christianity Today, here and there, though I'm not doing it quite as much anymore. But I also speak in a handful of venues. So yeah, my career has been building and growing things. That's what I've enjoyed. And it's been a real gift.
Jeff, could you share a bit about your own journey of generosity and how you entered the generosity movement?
Happy to. So my journey of generosity really starts, my wife and I, we are married. We are very typical folks going into ministry, I would say early in our marriage, and we just did not have much. And so making the commitment to even give 10% of a very little amount was very hard early, but it just felt like that was a core conviction. And so it started with, okay, a core conviction for us needs to be, we're going to be giving, we're going to be generous, even when it is difficult to do so. NCF was a major part of our journey of generosity as well. Years ago, I did my first jog with Brian Chrisman, who's now at Impact Foundation, and had a chance to hear other people's journeys of generosity. And that not only led us to getting more involved in NCF, but to think about what does it look like for us as a family to be generous. So NCF was a major part of it. And I also say we experienced some tension around it. And this is maybe something we could talk a little bit more about. The tension we experience is not only in giving money, but really being generous with our time. We are incredibly busy. We're like every other probably family with, a bunch of kids, and we've got soccer everywhere. But how do we make enough time in our life to pay attention to people, to care for our community, to be interior, quiet in our souls so we can actually pay attention to other people? That's probably the biggest generosity challenge that we have right now is we're moving so quickly, so constantly, and building and growing things, is how do we actually give a very deep form of generosity with this attention? So those are some tensions we experience, but NCF has played a major part in giving. And then it's also been fun to share and listen to other people's stories. My own journey of generosity, I was a fundraiser for, 10 years, but very full-time for about 5 years. And so hearing other people's stories of how they think about their work and their faith, which of course is Denver Institute for Faith and Work, but how they think about money and the values that come underneath when money is mentioned, that's been a major part of understanding not just what are we giving, but the question that has become more important for me is who are we becoming in the process of our working life?
Many more years ahead of you in this game of life and balancing that generosity of time. And you said, to chat about it a little bit. Do you ever take other kids to the soccer games with you?
Like our kids or with other people's kids?
Other people. I just remember, my kids were competitive swimmers. We were at a swimming pool 50 weeks a year. And I just know that during some of those times, the simple things of taking another child to the meet because their parents couldn't, doing different little errands in the realm that God has us at the moment. I mean, I can just picture you are being generous with your time and with other people in some of those small places that you may not see yourself. And sometimes it's just helpful to be reminded that it is a lifestyle that we're living, and we can do it in small ways that do add up over time.
Yeah, that's a good word. We have friends now that are in a different season of parenting. They have younger kids, and potentially picking them up on the way to the swim meet or the soccer game. We could do that, and it would feel to them like relief to have a babysitter for a while. And actually, our kids are older now. They're all babysitters just about. I think they would enjoy it too. So that's a good word. I'll bring it up. I'll bring it up tonight over dinner.
We talk often about the stewardship of your life, your labor, your influence, your finances and expertise. And I think wrapped up in there is that time component. I do want to riff on that a little bit more. Like what are things that you've been thinking about this? You're a deep thinker. So how are you leveraging time and how are you making room and time in a very busy schedule?
On the time side, that is our biggest trick. How are we making time? I would say the number one answer I have to that is we're always cheating for what's important. So like our marriage has to stay strong. We just have to do that. So we'll cheat and get away sometimes. We realize that our physical health, both eating healthy as well as exercising, if we want to be healthy for the next 10 years, we have to actually be doing that right now. And it feels weird to bug off and not do some work for a little while so we can exercise, but I'm such a better person to my kids and to my coworkers when I'm actually doing those things. And so I think it's actually thinking about our priorities and what does it mean for us? Like we have to have a clear picture for us. What does it mean for us to be holistically healthy? Then we actually have to build those things in there, knowing that there will always be another soccer game to go to and there's always going to be more work, but us being healthy people in the context of all that is very central. So we find ways to cheat for what's most important, like our core relationships and our spiritual and physical health.
I don't think you're cheating. I think you're balancing.
It feels like that. It feels like that though with work. It's sometimes it feels like you just I'm not going to get that done. I'm going to push that down the road a little bit. So, but I hear what you're saying. It does feel like it's sometimes.
Recently, you were a speaker at the Kingdom Advisors annual gathering, and in a talk you spoke about the generosity movement and the idea of stewardship, which we talk a lot about here, and we agree with your comments. So would you flesh out some of the unintended consequences of a stewardship mentality? Was something that you brought up in that talk, and I thought that was because we talk so much about stewardship, I thought it would be really great to hear from you on the unintentional consequences of a stewardship mentality.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts on that. So my career has been on the faith and work world, and so I had a chance to study the faith and work movement, which is at least 100 years in America, longer if we take it back to the Protestant Reformation. Very close to that, right, is the generosity movement. And so in preparation for this talk, I studied it a little bit, taking a look at the real rise and explosion of evangelism in the 1960s, because in post-World War II America, the creation of organizations like Compassion and World Vision, and then how to fund those. And the generosity movement really grew and was instrumental in funding these very large parachurch organizations that have had a hugely positive influence. And so the core idea in the generosity movement is the idea of stewardship, right? And it's the idea that God is the owner of all things. We're his stewards, and God has entrusted to us wealth for the sake of his mission. And I'm a huge fan, I should say this, of stewardship, because it is a deeply biblical idea that God is the owner of everything and we are managers and not owners. So I do think that's important. But two, I think, unintended consequences that can happen in our cultural context in America and how this idea has grown. So stewardship, especially when applied to giving, it tended to suggest that if we have more money, that must mean we're called to steward it for two things: evangelism and poverty. Those are the two big areas that evangelicals have been involved with for most of the century. And across the board, we didn't tend to, though, ask how we made the money, but we instead emphasized make the most money we can so we can give the most money we can. So Wesley has that famous injunction, earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can. So the implicit message here was the reason that you have this money is to give it and to make a big kingdom impact. And so how we made the money has been less of a conversation. So I think that first unintended consequence is make the most you can to give the most you can. And that's what it means to have an impact. And I do think there is an issue there in that make the most you can. We have to think about not only how we're making it, right, as well as what we're doing with it. The second idea, though, that I think is even more important, the idea of if stewardship is the only central biblical teaching about money, we tend to focus on what to do with the money rather than what the money is doing to us. And I think that makes generosity first an exterior question about impact rather than an interior question, a spiritual question. And that is an outlier in the scope of church history. I mean, money itself through the early church in the Middle Ages was seen as oftentimes mammon or a dark force competing with Christ for loyalty. Throughout the Middle Ages, you had people taking his vows of poverty. They weren't thinking about necessarily how to get a lot to make a big impact. They were thinking about very different things. I'll just kind of say that. And so the idea that money actually can very much distort the soul and is a central competitor for loyalty with Christ, we do talk about that in the generosity movement, but stewardship tends to focus a little bit more on how do I steward this for impact rather than how is money influencing and shaping me. And I actually think Jesus is very interested in what's happening in our souls and even what comes out of our souls when we're talking about money. So I think those are two unintended potential consequences of stewardship.
I think of that first comment that you made of, make all that you can. That just fits with our culture here in America of we're all about achievement, right? And so that's where that achievement has, really that achievement mentality has influenced us, that we do win when we achieve more. And that is just infiltrated in the churches and parachurch organizations, all of that. And as you pointed out, is that what we're all called to? There are many different things I think God calls us to, and we do, because really, to me, in the generosity movement, it's about our hearts. Christ wholly wants our hearts to be his. and he doesn't want any of our holdbacks. And finances tend to be the thing that we hold back until last to give over to God.
I think that idea of winning or success in our culture is an idol that we really have to think through. So Amy Minnick, has she been on this podcast? She has. So wonderful person, amazing thinker. Man, has done a lot of work on this biblical concept of gleaning or of not harvesting essentially to the edge of your fields, but allowing the poor there and what that could mean for modern business. I think she's just a wonderful thought leader in that. And I think that one of the reasons why we are not interested in taking lower returns, and this is actually Amy's idea, if we push returns from, 20% down to say 8% because it makes sense to invest in businesses in Africa, like we should be investing in Talenton, for instance, our friend Jen Halverson, it looks like we're not winning as much, or we can't say that to our peers. What does winning look like? So it's a little cleaner to say, I made a market rate return and killed it over here. Now I'm killing it over here by giving away tons of money. And it's still sort of that narrative of how successful I am rather than this release of this is actually God's. And that's actually a good part of that stewardship conversation again.
Jeff, you went on to share in that message that you believe it means that we need to recover a holistic message of generosity. I think that's a great segue of what you're talking about. Could you flesh that out? Like what is that when we think about that holistic message?
Yeah, well, I think the holistic message touches all of our life. Generosity can be the way we work, our relationships, how we're involved in our communities. But I also think the foundation of that is generosity is not first about external impact. It's about who we're becoming. It's actually generosity from the inside out. And what I think the basis of the holistic mission of generosity, it really is receiving God's generosity. So even in some of this language of the kingdom in the Gospels, Jesus doesn't talk about building the kingdom or expanding the kingdom or kingdom impact. The two major things that he says about his kingdom is enter and receive. So apparently, Jesus doesn't think the kingdom needs building. Do more people need to come to faith? Yes, absolutely. However, his kingdom exists, and he's calling people to enter into this beautiful, elaborate, abundant world of which he is providing everything that we need. And he says, first, just receive my goodness into you. Like, receive this. And I actually think that before we do the work of giving, before we even think about our charitable plans, I think we have to think about, am I fully content with all that God has given me? So C.S. Lewis famously said, he who has God and everything else has no more than he who has God alone. Do we really believe that when we have Christ, we are infinitely rich? We cannot get any richer. For Good Friday, several weeks ago when we were at the service, one of the songs was a Hillsong, and it's titled, My Wealth is in the Cross. And that is interesting to think about. What Christ has done, all of the riches of heaven have been poured out to me through the cross. So that's a lot of theology, but it does actually mean that we need to sit a little bit in what it looks like to receive God's generosity. And that can sometimes be hard when our hands are full, when we've got a lot of things, I'm just saying this from my own experience, like we've just got world standards, I'm very wealthy, I'm always managing work I have to do and contractors coming to the house, there's a lot sort of going on. And there is this was the logic in the Middle Ages of when you let go of that and you sort of have an empty hand, God pours into that empty hand the riches of heaven. And I do think there are a lot of interior work that we can do in the generosity movement so that we're really free. I mean, we want to enter into this conversation being free from the draw and the pull of money. And that takes spiritual disciplines. It takes family. It takes church. It takes time. It takes work to be able to receive that deeply and in our interior lives.
I would also say, Jeff, there's also that deep level of trust that God has us. And that's what receiving it really is it's a process inside of our hearts that we are truly trusting. It's not our achievement. It's not the things that we do. It's the things that God has already done. And that is just such a mind shift for most of us to be able to recognize that we don't have control or power over any of it, but God has all of that.
Yeah, amen. I totally agree.
So Jeff, what's the overflow of the gift of receiving the kingdom look like?
Yeah, I think the overflow of that is this holistic generosity that starts to influence a lot of our lives. It influences our contentment and our willingness to have lots or have nothing. Either can be okay with us. But I also think it moves again from the inside out, right? So it influences the way we think about money and the way you read the Wall Street Journal and how we think about investing. It influences how we think about our work. And what does it mean to be generous in our work with employees or with coworkers, or even the type of work we do? Maybe we'll choose a job that makes less because we're contributing our skills in a way that the Lord is calling us to. We're not making the most we can so that we can give the most we can. I also think that generosity, and this is something I think a lot about with my daughters as well as my community, but that relational generosity. And Eric, you've been really relationally generous with just even relationships in town and in Denver with me. And so I wanted to thank you for that. But I think generous with our networks and our relationships and giving those to others, giving time and attention to people that otherwise feel like, I've got so much to do, I can't do that. But actually, God wants us to deeply pay attention to the people in our life. I think being generous with time and attention, being generous with sitting with people in their pain, as well as then I think finally moving out into our community, being generous in our community, find ways for us to be a part of God's shalom that He's bringing about. So it is a holistic journey of all these different areas, but I do think it has to be rooted deep in our souls for it to last and endure. Because I've actually seen both in my life as well as other people's lives, if you just do the impact stuff first, you're going to be disappointed. The impact won't be as big as you thought. It won't be quite as satisfying. The meaning you look for from that impact may be fleeting. And I've seen that time and time again with thinking, oh, I gave that to that charity and they didn't do as good or as much as I thought. And I've actually seen cynicism, sometimes bitterness can get in there as well. So there is this interior to exterior journey that I think for you to have a joyful experience of generosity, it really does sort of rest in this receiving God's goodness and generosity first.
Jeff, something that you just said just sparked a thought in my mind. Having worked for a very large ministry, there is a process that I know that I went through, and I really had to recognize, it is a privilege to be in the space to do that ministry work that God's calling. But at the same time, God has enough money in the world and power in the world to solve the issues that are out there. He actually chooses to let us have a part of that because He wants our hearts to be in that space of really letting Him have control, doing the work and recognizing it's our hearts that God wants in the process of what we're giving and the process of how we're serving also.
Yeah, I love that. Rather than thinking about impact and that's how I'll gain meaning for my life is through impact and generosity, I think the other side of that is this feeling of participation with the work that already God is doing in us and through us. So it is receiving a prompting. And it could be in generosity, it could be in our work, it could be in a relationship, but receiving a prompting to participate with Him in His redemptive work. And that also is pretty light. So if something goes wrong, as anybody that's been in work or business for more than 2 days who knows that things go wrong, we're not angry. It's His mission. It's His work. And He knows that we're doing what we can with these, aging bodies, at least I'm feeling a little bit of that these days, to participate in that. But it allows a little bit more of a joyfulness and lightness, knowing that it's His world and it's His redemptive story first.
Yeah. And I think it helped me to take myself off of the pedestal that I was doing this great calling from God, but that I was joining Him in His work. And I had the privilege of being alongside Him.
A minute ago, you were talking about a little bit about like what work would look like, and I wonder if you'd flesh out, what might expressing God's generosity through your work look like, or ask another way, what might a generous business look like?
Yeah, so a few thoughts on that. I actually do believe giving generously of the profits from business is a good part of the way that the Lord works through businesses to either charities or potentially even directly back to employees. So I do think there's a real goodness for giving money, but it also could be lots of other things. So it could be hiring somebody with a challenging background. So Nehemiah Manufacturing in Cincinnati, they're like a leading second chance employer. And they think we need good people here, and there are people that need a second chance, and we actually need employees. And that could mean a whole other commitment in terms of HR and what it looks like to care for people, a way that still can benefit the business, absolutely. But that could be an aspect of generosity that you think, if I have 10 people to hire this next year, what would it look like for us to choose to look through, local corrections and people that are working with nonprofits and getting their life back on track. So that could be it as well. It could be things like chaplaincy. It could be giving volunteer days to your employees. It could be investing in healthy culture in your workplace, or sponsoring a barbecue. It could be generosity through professional development, education, knowing that we have an opportunity to really grow people's human capital capacity there. Generosity in a workplace also could be, if you're a business owner, it could be selling equity, not only to private equity, but could be to an employee trust and thinking about employees as owners for the next generation as well. So there's a lot of good opportunities in a business or in a workplace to think about generosity. If you're a business owner, but also if you're an employee or mid-level manager, there's a lot of things you can do to say, the Lord's calling me to be generous in this time, in this place, as an expression of God's grace.
That's really good. I appreciate those thoughts. As I think back on some of our past guests, I can see like markers where we've seen several of those things play out, and super encouraging. And it's good for us and for listeners to think like, hey, how can I better steward this business that God's entrusted me with to, and play a part in for my team and growth in the community. You also earlier teased out a little bit idea about how the holistic view of generosity will also impact our investing. Would you flesh that out a little bit more as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the investing side, and I'm sure you've maybe had guests on the podcast talk about this, but it's grown so much in the last 10 years of how people are thinking about faith in investing. And we've gone through a lot of different iterations of what this has looked like, and there's a lot of different frameworks for it. But I think we've really gone through a season of what do we not want to invest in, particularly in public equities and things that are potentially damaging the world. That could be obvious things like adult entertainment industry or gambling that we would not want to invest in. But I've also think we've said, what does it look like for us to have a positive impact with others through our investing? And that goes everything from, impact investing, it could be overseas, and it could be also more market rate stuff as well. So that movement has grown tremendously. And I do think that, just to say this briefly on this podcast, it doesn't mean because you're a believer and you're investing that you have to necessarily take a lower return. However, I do think that conversation should be on the table for all believers, is that if we think about return more broadly than only financial return, but if there's also spiritual and social return, that means we're thinking more holistically about both generosity as well as what impact or what does return look like. That could open up lots of conversations about what investing looks like. So I'm sure many of your listeners have public equities and retirement accounts, but also in private businesses or even in real estate, if people are investing in these things, looking at what is the social and the spiritual impact there, that's something that a lot of believers are doing. And both with those that are sort of retail investors as well as those that are more like accredited investors, there's becoming more and more opportunities across the landscape to think about aligning your faith with your investing. So to come back to our topic for today, that generosity piece, if God's grace is central to the Christian faith and our expression of that is being generous, that might allow us to think about an investment that may have a lower return, but a greater sort of social and spiritual impact. And that could be an expression of generous investing.
Well, Jeff, I'm curious if there's anything else you'd like to share with the listeners on the Generosity Now podcast.
Yeah, I would just share that the interior work is the hardest work. At least it has been in my life. Do I have a scarcity mentality with my time or my resources, or is there abundance mentality? Like all the things that I struggle with, everything from being short-tempered with my kids to, lots of different things I struggle with. I just think the interior work is the hard work. And so I would encourage listeners to really think about, what does it look like for me to receive God's generosity, receive his grace on a day-to-day basis? What are the habits and practices I need to build into my life that allow me to let go, allow me to really be free, and allow me to be okay with having a big impact or no impact, having a business that scales huge or a business that doesn't, having the coolest family on the block or the nerdiest or the least cool family on the block. Either one of those, I just think that pouring out of God's generosity and his riches into our hearts, that is where the joy lies. If we can stay there and rest there, I think that's where the good stuff is. So I'd encourage listeners to just keep that in mind.
And as we talked a little bit about earlier, that it's a journey for all of us. And I think we need to give ourselves grace if we didn't do it great one day, and pick it up again the next day of, God, we just want to be able to be reflective and receive your generosity and be able to share it with others. Because it is a journey. None of us are going to arrive. I often have a saying, the only day that any of us are going to be perfect is the day that we get to be face to face with Jesus.
Amen.
It's a good word there. Jeff, hey, how can people keep in touch with you, your work, your writing? You got some new writings you working on, I wonder?
Yeah, so I have a couple books out. One is called An Uncommon Guide to Retirement. The other one is a little bit more the topic of this podcast. It's called Working from the Inside Out. So how do we live and work in a way that is resonant with this holistic gospel? You can stay in touch with me, jeffhaanen.com. So my last name is HAANEN.com. Is some of my writing. And then my personal website for some of my own consulting work is jeffhaanen.io. So those are a couple ways you can stay in touch.
That's great. Well, Jeff, we've really appreciated you being on the Generosity Now podcast. On the podcast, we do seek to inspire, equip, and connect our listeners for generous kingdom impact and whole life stewardship. For more information on us, please check us out at ncfgiving.com/Rocky Mountains and generositynow.org. Please go ahead and subscribe to our podcast. Leave us a 5-star review and share with your network. And today we've got a quote that Jeff's going to read from A.W. Tozer first, and then Laurie's got the doxology out of 2 Corinthians chapter 8.
Okay, so here's the quote from A.W. Tozer's from The Pursuit of God, and I think it's very fitting for this topic of generosity from the inside out. The man who has God for his treasure has all things in one. Many ordinary treasures may be denied him, or if he is allowed to have them, the enjoyment of them will be so tempered that they will never be necessary to his happiness. Or if he must see them go one after one, he will scarcely feel a sense of loss. For having the source of all things, he has in one all satisfaction, all pleasure, all delight. Whatever he may lose, he has actually lost nothing. For now he has it all in one, and he has it purely, legitimately, and forever.
And from 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich. Jeff, thanks so much for being on today with us. We really enjoy our relationship and our conversations with you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's so good to have you. Thanks, brother.